morning everyone, and welcome to today's State of the Service Roadshow event. My name is Phil Lancaster and I work at the Australian Public Service Commission here in Canberra. Today's event has a very different look and feel to our usual approach to this event series, but I very much hope that you'll find the next 70 minutes or so informative and engaging, and perhaps even inspiring. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land here in Canberra that I'm speaking from this morning. I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional custodians on whose country you are participating from, as well as to their elders and any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who might be participating in today's event. Before I get into the detail of today's event, did you know that the APS as an institution has its own presence on social media? So if you're interested in keeping up to speed on things across the service, I'd encourage you to follow us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter and on Instagram. Details of those platforms are coming up on the screen now. So this is a whole series of events right across Australia, starting with the Canberra launch event, which took place in February, and it took place in the former House of Representatives chamber in Old Parliament House in Canberra. Video from that event is available on the APSC website, and I do encourage you to check it out if you have a moment. At that event, you'll hear from the Honourable Ben Morton MP, Assistant Minister to the Minister for the Public Service, addressing the APS on the great work that was done throughout 2020, and also announcing details about the new APS Academy and the upcoming APS exhibition at the Museum of Australian Democracy. There's also a presentation from APS Commissioner Peter Woolcott on the state of the service in 2020. We've also had a number of state-based events, and it's been really great to see the strong engagement from APS colleagues thus far around Australia. We usually do face-to-face events, so a purely virtual approach is not our preference, but there's no doubt that it has enabled many more people to participate. And to complement today's event, you can also find state-based statistical slideshows on the state of the service on the APSC website. Today's event will be in two parts. Firstly, we'll have a Q&A session with Mary Wiley-Smith, Deputy Australian Public Service Commissioner, to answer questions submitted from the online audience via Slido. We'll then move to the second part of today's event, which is a panel discussion on the topic Spirit of Service. We have two of our Western Australia-based colleagues who've agreed to talk a little bit about what it means for them to be APS employees and to give some personal reflections on the last 12 months. Then we'll go to a Q&A session with the panel, where they'll answer some pre-prepared questions and also questions submitted via Slido from the online audience. That's it for the introductions. I'm very pleased to welcome Deputy Commissioner Mary Wiley-Smith to answer your questions as part of this first Q&A session. The one at the top there, Mary, is referring to the Academy. So someone said it feels like we're a long way from Canberra. What will the Academy look like for us? And I'm assuming us being us in them in WA.
Yeah, so it should feel exactly the same as it does to anyone anywhere else in Australia. The Academy might be being hosted here at the Museum of Democracy, but it's not really a bricks and mortar institution. And so all of the programs that are available to people in Canberra are the same programs that will be available to people working anywhere else in Australia. So as I mentioned, I think they're starting with virtual programs first, but then they will actually, when it's appropriate to do so, start to have much more kind of face-to-face engagement as well, and programs delivered in your state or territory, or even with your agencies. So this is really a networked kind of partnership model.
Okay, next question there. It seems like COVID-19 has changed the purpose of the APS with more of a focus on delivery. Will this continue to be the case? I'd probably be interested, Mary, in your thoughts on whether it has actually changed the purpose of the APS.
So I don't think it has. There is a focus on delivery when we know exactly what we need to deliver, and it's a huge challenge, and we can see that happens over time, and we know that the Australian Public Service is very good at those periods in time. So we have clear kind of understanding of what we need to do and what the goals are. So we're good at working together to achieve that. But delivery is just part of what we do. And if you go back to the role of the Australian Public Service and have a read of the Public Service Act, we're here to support the government, the community, and also Parliament. And we do that in a range of ways. And what we saw even during COVID is we thought that we would take people off what we called non-critical functions and then put them into delivery. What we've realised through 2020 is that all those functions are pretty crucial, and that we've needed to actually get some extra staff in and actually support what we do, because everything was important for Australians. And the focus is on Australians, and if we're focusing on our obligations to government and the community, that means policy development, that means regulation, that means collecting taxes. It's not just about delivery. I think that all the roles that we perform are pretty essential to the lives of Australians.
Absolutely, and interestingly, that's one of the things that we've really been trying to highlight through this Roadshow event series is the sheer diversity, the breadth of what it is that the APS does, and how that then connects each of these roles, whether it's Antarctic Division down in Hobart, or Bushfire Recovery Agency, or the National Indigenous Australians Agency working in remote communities. Each one of these roles in one way or another really does connect back to serving either the government, the people, and the Parliament of Australia. So, another question at the top there. WA roles are low level, so the majority of the highest proportion of staff in WA are at the APS 4 level with a high age profile. So that's referring to the fact that fewer people in the under 40 category and more in the over 50 category compared to the broader APS average. What strategies are being considered to increase the complexity of roles to attract people?
Yeah. So this goes back to the workforce strategy that I mentioned. So right across the service, it's a bit of an umbrella strategy for how we deal with workforce issues going forward. And each agency now has a responsibility to go and use the strategy to develop their own kind of plans for what they're doing in terms of their workforce, including looking at their roles, what kind of skills they need for the future. One of the priorities in the strategy is how we attract and retain good people. And every agency is going to have to be focused on that for the future, as well as upskilling the staff that are still here and want to stay, because I think that what we know is with data and digital, we are seeing some changes in the way the workforce is needed for the future. And so I think you're going to see a huge focus on reskilling and on the attraction and retention of good staff in the service. And secretaries are talking about it, and agency heads, they were pretty involved in the development of the strategy. So I can tell you that most agencies are hassling the APSC now to see if we can get involved in the next stage, which is really working through their own workforce plans and skills development and what they need for the future. And I think that flexible work and what the service might look like in the future will actually benefit a lot of the states and the territories, because hopefully we'll have a network system where people can actually, work where they live. So great opportunities, I think, for our states and territories.
And a great opportunity as well for staff in those strategic HR and workforce planning roles, which are often seen as being sort of put to one side in that sort of enabling category, but there's a broad recognition, isn't there, Mary, that those are critical enabling roles to actually implement and make the workforce strategy happen.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's one of the reasons that the Secretary's Board agreed to the HR profession going first, because if we can strengthen the profession, get them focused on these strategic type issues, build capability, then they can assist the rest of the workforce to transition.
Back to the questions on Slido. So there's one there, how do we ensure that we don't return to slow, risk-averse practices once COVID is no longer an issue?
So that's a great question. And I don't know if you can tell, but Phil and I are in the same room and he's just sitting right beside me. So you're probably seeing cuts of both of us, but we're actually here trying to stop talking to one another and just focus on you. So apologies if we look like we're kind of like talking to a wall or something. It's actually just each other. So this particular issue about we don't want to actually stop kind of the lessons learned and the positive things that we've found through COVID has come up a number of times in the Chief Operating Officer Committee, which is a committee of Secretaries Board. And we've looked at all of the things that have worked really well during COVID that we want to keep. And I can tell you that there's a pretty committed group of very senior people in the service that want to make sure that we don't go back to our old ways in the longer term. And so we are really kind of focusing on that and how we operate. I mean, we could remove barriers and, we found quick ways to do things which normally would involve a lot of processes and red tape. And so all of those types of success stories that we've seen, you've got a pretty committed group of executives that don't want to see that kind of return. And if it is happening in your own workplace, I'd flag it with your senior managers because it's not what we want for the future of the service.
Excellent. So there's a question there about integrity. Someone saying, I see lack of integrity in my work area. Not sure training is the answer. People know what is right and wrong, but the system allows them to get away with it.
Yeah. So that's a bit of a worry. I would say if that's what you're seeing, then you should be flagging it. Most departments have a fraud area, they have an integrity area, they have a compliance kind of area. Depending on what kind of integrity issue it is, it might be wanting to chat to the HR area about your concerns. But given the Public Service, the PGP Act, the way the Public Service Act is written, our code of conduct, there shouldn't be any excuse for that. And so if it is an integrity issue, you should be raising it, and sometimes just be aware it could be a perceived integrity issue because you don't always know what's happening. But if there is a problem and the system is letting people get away with poor behaviour, then as a public servant, you should be calling it.
Yeah. And as you said, every single agency has to have sort of processes and procedures in place to enable staff to raise those issues.
And you can even call it through the confidential employee census. And at the moment, I talked about the integrity data, and it's really low. So if you're seeing stuff like that, it's anonymous, the census, you should be actually raising those issues because that's how your senior leaders look and see where there are particular problems in the system and can send someone in to have a look. Yeah.
And this year's census, last year's census was delayed. This year's census is due to launch quite shortly, I believe, in a few weeks' time. So it'll be another opportunity for people to share their views there. Question about the Surge Reserve. Will the Surge Reserve have remote working opportunities? Otherwise, not much point in WA-based staff expressing interest. Well, I guess that implies that there's never going to be a need in WA, which we don't know. But,
no, and we've already surged people in WA into, so we've got a group of public servants in the APS that have volunteered to assist the WA government, so the state government, if there's a COVID outbreak, and they've been on kind of standby and training for a while. So for us, for a future reserve, they'd be part of it. So we don't know where a disaster is going to happen. We don't know what it looks like. But with the ability to have people working remotely, and we know that we can do that because we've seen it, we've moved people to working remotely at scale in the service. I don't think that location is a barrier anymore, and we are certainly accepting people from outside of Canberra into the Surge Reserve. And even Services Australia, they've just done another surge. The people that they're bringing in to assist have got a new kind of, I think, in the box kind of solution where they actually can do it anywhere in Australia. And so you get kind of the equipment, the setup and the training all remotely, and you can work anywhere. So some kind of great opportunities there for public servants no matter where you work or live.
Okay, just two more questions that we'll look at. So firstly, following on that surge question, one about mobility, someone saying, there don't seem to be mobility opportunities in my agency. Do you have suggestions for finding these opportunities externally?
Yeah. So what we do see is there is more mobility, I think, in Canberra, and I think it's because it's kind of accepted that it's a good thing to do for your career. We see fairly low levels of mobility in most states and territories, and what I've really noticed in meeting a lot of my state and territory colleagues is that they don't even necessarily know each other, and so it was only last week we started to put in our kind of SES colleagues down in working out of Tasmania together so that they can meet one another and start chatting. And I think that's part of it. It's kind of working out opportunities that can join agencies together, and a couple of really willing managers can make that connection and work out mobility opportunities, because you can just do secondments and swaps between agencies, and they're pretty simple to do. We in the APSC provide information on how to do it. It's basically a 2-page document that 2 agencies just sign off really quickly, and you can swap people into different roles. And for building capability and for career opportunities, it's just really a great thing to do.
I think that's a really important point, actually, that it doesn't have to be a permanent transfer at level. You know, there are a whole lot of other ways that you can broaden your experience through a variety of mechanisms.
Yeah, and secondments are great because you don't change the pay and your conditions, and your super all stays with the same agency. But and if you do a swap, there's no financial kind of issues with either agency. If it's just a one-way, then it could be that the receiving agency just reimburses your salary and costs to your home agency. So it's a pretty simple thing to do, and I would encourage you to raise it and look for opportunities to bring people in the APS together in WA.
Excellent. And last question. Is it a question or a comment? Anyway, someone's saying, I agree, don't want to be risk averse, but how do you balance expectations of extraordinary effort as a normal state? By definition, extraordinary can't be usual.
Yeah.
So I guess this maybe is also linked to this idea that the APS does perform extraordinarily well in a crisis, and how do we sort of bottle that crisis approach and have it on tap ready to inform our business as usual?
So I had a chat to a group of Band 1s this morning in a leadership program, and it was a virtual program. They were joining from right around Australia, and this type of question came up. And some of them are under enormous pressure, and I suspect their staff are under enormous pressure. And my advice to them is it's not sustainable. And at the end of the day, the Australian Public Service wants you for the long term, and we want you to actually be healthy. We care about your well-being, and so resilience is really important. And so there will be times when you have to work really, really hard, and it's under pressure, but you need to actually step back sometimes and make sure that you take leave, that you're very clear with your managers about what you can and can't do, and that we don't want to see people fall over because they're just continuing to work at that kind of pace. That's not what anyone in the exec of the Australian Public Service is asking people to do. If you're working in areas like that, I would say you probably need to think about, if your manager is not assisting you to actually work more reasonable hours, it's probably worth trying to change jobs or taking one of those mobility opportunities, because it's not sustainable in the longer term, and at the end of the day you'll end up hurting yourself and your own health and well-being.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Mary. So look, I think we'll draw a close there to this first part of today's event. Big thanks to Mary for spending some time with us this morning, for answering those questions, and thank you, Mary.
That's all right. Thanks, Phil, and thanks for having me. And enjoy the next bit, which is where you actually get to ask some of your own colleagues some tough questions over in WA. But thanks very much, and thanks for letting me join you today. Bye. Okay. So we'll now move to the second section, the second segment of this morning's event, which is a panel discussion on the topic of spirit of service. And we will leave Slido open, so please feel free to continue to put questions through using Slido
to the two members of the panel that we have poised to join us. No, they've joined us. They're poised to speak and answer questions this morning. So let me introduce our two panellists for today. We have Martin Plummer, who is the Assistant Director with responsibility for the Perth office of the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. Originally from New Zealand, Martin completed his schooling in Perth and studied law at UWA. After 6 years with a private law firm in Perth, Martin commenced as a lawyer with the CDPP, the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, in 1994. And he has undertaken advice, trial, appellate and partner agency liaison work across a broad range of matters that the CDPP conducts. And that includes drug offending, corporate crime, it includes fraud and people smuggling, and it also includes counter-terrorism. So a wide range of legal and professional legal experience there. Martin currently manages a branch of 18 lawyers prosecuting Commonwealth offences in WA, but also in the external territories of Christmas Island and the Cocos and Keeling Islands. So thank you very much, Martin, for making the time to be with us this morning.
Thank you.
And we also have Aidan Storer, who is the State Director of Western Australia for the Australian Treasury. He's also a Principal Advisor with Treasury's Business Liaison Unit, which was a function that was formed in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic to drive Treasury's business engagement on cross-cutting policy issues. Aidan's been with Treasury since 2006, and he's managed teams in the areas of competition and consumer policy, social policy, and international finance and development. Prior to this current role, Aidan was a Principal Advisor with the Financial System Division, working on the implementation of recommendations from the Financial Services Royal Commission. In 2017 and 2018, Aidan lived in Port Moresby. He was deployed to Papua New Guinea's Department of Treasury, where he served as a technical advisor for PNG's hosting of APEC in 2018. And Aidan also led the Secretariat for the 2016 Commonwealth State Review of the Australian Consumer Law. So again, a very wide range of responsibilities and policy areas there. Before Treasury, or outside of Treasury, Aidan has worked at Austrade and at the former Department of Industry, Science and Resources, as well as within the WA state government. I think, Aidan, you are Perth born and bred, or WA born and bred, is that right?
Yeah, Phil, that's correct. I grew up here, so it's lovely to be back even if it's just for a few years.
Excellent. So thanks very much, Aidan, for making the time to be with us this morning. So we've got a few pre-prepared questions for our two panellists, and which are we're really trying to draw out their personal reflections and their personal experience. So we've got some pre-prepared questions, but please don't hesitate to put through questions using Slido. But in the meantime, I'll start with the scripted approach, and I'll firstly ask both Aidan and Martin. I'll start with you, Martin, if that's okay, to reflect briefly on this idea of spirit of service. So what does spirit of service mean to you? What does it mean to you to be a public servant?
Look, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to join this discussion. I'd like to respond to this first aspect through the prism of what I do, to give people a bit of background of where I'm coming from. Whilst the Commonwealth DPP is within the Attorney General's portfolio, our office essentially functions independently of government. We're a specialised part of the APS, engaged predominantly in the prosecution of federal offences in each state, territory and external territory. Running complex criminal litigation can be unrelenting. It's fast-paced and often stressful. In this work, I see the spirit of service as very closely tied to what is the role of a prosecutor. So, quoting from a Canadian decision that's been endorsed by our High Court, the role of the prosecutor is not to obtain conviction. It is to lay before the jury what the Crown considers to be credible evidence relevant to what is alleged to be a crime. Counsel have a duty to see that all available legal proof of facts is presented. It should be done firmly and pressed to its legitimate strength, but it must also be done fairly. The role of the prosecutor excludes any notion of winning or losing. His and her function is a matter of public duty, that which in civil life one cannot be charged with greater personal responsibility. It is to be efficiently performed with an ingrained sense of dignity, the serious and justness of the judicial proceedings. So, the spirit of service for me is to act at all times with fairness, with justice, and with efficiency. These things are in our prosecution policy. In commencing and continuing each prosecution, it must be in the public interest. The prosecutor serves the community and supports the broad APS through working to maintain the rule of law. In sentencing offenders, we make submissions both as to specific deterrence for the persons before the court, but also as to general deterrence. We also support the broader APS, that is, our partner agencies, all of you, through training, advice, and through law reform. So this sense of justice, fairness, and service to the community is what attracted me to the office, and it's what attracts all of our staff to the office and provides me and all of us with our sense of purpose. And in that way, I think we are no different to what should and does motivate all in the public service. So that's my response first up.
Thanks, Martin. And look, I was very intrigued actually by one specific thing you said there, which is it's not about winning or losing. And I think, I'm just reacting sort of personally, I guess, maybe betraying my own ignorance in this, but maybe our perception of this, do you think, I'm going off script, I apologise, I did flag that I might do this ahead of time. Are we coloured by what we see on TV, about the dramatisation of courtroom events where it does seem to be very much a winning or losing approach? Do you think? Or
yes, but possibly we are. Obviously, TV has to have that broad appeal to achieve ratings, but in the law, in prosecuting criminal matters, it's for us to get the case before the jury, for us to get the case before the trier of fact. The judge magistrate is trier of fact in a judge alone or a magistrate's court matter, or the jury in a jury trial. It's for them to make that decision to convict. It's critical for us to ensure that we're not trying to win at all costs. Rather, firmly, appropriately and professionally, we put all relevant material before the court. So that includes information that may run counter to our case. So the spirit of service, for all of us, and in particular for those in the DPP, it is definitely that aspect of justice and fairness.
And professionalism as well. That's great. Thank you for that. Aidan, what about you? What is spirit of service? What does that mean to you?
Okay, thanks, Phil. And firstly, again, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today, and here in Perth, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that have joined today's event. I guess in terms of your question, Phil, I sort of reflected back on my career, and I know you've talked a little bit in the intro about some of the things that I've done, and the idea of spirit of service, and certainly what stood out to me in a kind of a 20-year career that hopefully has a little bit longer to run, but it really is the opportunities and the variety of opportunities that the public APS offers, as well as some of the sense of purpose of some of the work that you can do through that career. I did join the APS back in 1998 and moved to Canberra after working for a couple of years in the WA Public Service and had, as you mentioned, worked in 3 different Commonwealth government agencies. And I guess they've all been in the sort of area of policy development and advice, and certainly in that case with the APS, there are so many myriad opportunities across different agencies and within agencies where you can obviously apply your skills, develop skills and experiences, and work in different roles and contexts. And certainly, as a self-described generalist, and who can apply those skills in those different areas, I felt that as I've sort of charted my career, the opportunities that have been presented have been numerous. If you're prepared to sort of put your hat in the ring and potentially make that move and to embrace those new opportunities. And as you mentioned, Phil, that's enabled me to work on some really important areas of work through my career, as you mentioned, around consumer, but also in competition law, in energy policy, a number of years ago, financial services reform, particularly coming out of the Financial Services Royal Commission and the sort of landmark work that was done in that Royal Commission. Also worked on some budgets and really grappling with some issues around social policy, which of course are incredibly important, and in some different contexts around international engagement. Those roles have taken me, obviously, to Canberra, but also to overseas. As Phil mentioned, having the opportunity to work in Papua New Guinea Treasury, which is a very different organisation, not only to Commonwealth Treasury, but to any sort of public service agency in Australia. So the very, very different experience in that regard. And also having worked with Austrade in Vietnam and working with Australian businesses to try and enter new overseas markets. Just those different experiences of really trying to think about working with, obviously, with the business community, with thinking about the well-being of our citizens in terms of policy development and implementation, and even to do some capacity building in an overseas context. And obviously now the opportunity to come back to Perth and to lead the Commonwealth Treasury's presence in Perth, which is small but growing, has been really important in terms of how we build stakeholder relationships in WA with a variety of stakeholders, and also to monitor and report on developments in the WA economy. And I guess that's been really important during COVID, where the fact that we have sort of boots on the ground in Perth, which has only been around for about 3 years, we were able to really monitor what was happening in different sectors within the WA economy, be that the housing market, be that in terms of the jobs market, in other sectors, and really feed that back to Treasury, which, as you would imagine and you would have seen, have really critical roles to play in terms of giving advice to government around policy interventions and government supports. So I guess that all of those roles have enabled me to grow personally and professionally, develop new skills, gather new experiences, and work with many different people in different contexts. And I think the APS is, I can't think of many other professions where you get those diversity of opportunities. Also, just in terms of the sense of purpose that I've developed through my career of working in the APS, I think often, particularly when you work in the policy area, you can often feel that it's hard to see where you make a tangible impact. Policy development can be a slow and messy and at times frustrating process. We can often feel that we're several steps removed from where policy actually impacts on the ground, and governments often don't take our advice, nor do we always get the policy outcomes that we seek to achieve. But I think when we do get the timing, the design and the implementation of policy right, we can see that we can have a real positive impact on the well-being of Australians. And I think there's no better example of this over the last year, when the APS, as has been mentioned, had really stepped up to play such a key role in helping Australia respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, both through health measures and also economic support measures. And I guess that's what, through that experience, that has also given me pause, and I think many of you probably as well have reflected on your life and your careers as well, and what it means to work in the APS at this such an unprecedented time. And I think that's a really important thing I'd like to leave with people, is to sometimes take stock and reflect on what you've done, and take an open mind about the impacts you've had, and take some strength out of those sort of contributions we've all made through parts of our career.
Thanks, Aidan. I might come back to you in a sec just to ask a question about your PNG experience, but before I do that, I'll just ask you what prompted you to join the APS in the first instance.
Look, I guess I grew up in Perth, and I came from a family of teachers, public servants themselves, in the WA public education system. So I guess that idea of public service was something that I was exposed to from an early age and growing up. And certainly my parents took a lot of interest in current events, and my brother and I would often have conversations at the dinner table with mum and dad about the issues of the day, and that really made me think about sort of contemporary issues and in some ways policy. I didn't really realise it at the time what that really meant. But I guess when I went to university and did my first degree, that was when I really started developing that interest in public policy. Studied a Bachelor of Arts in UWA, looking into political science and industrial relations and sociology, and did an honours degree in political science. And then I guess that really did sort of entrench my interest in public policy more broadly. As you mentioned, Phil, I'd started in the WA Public Service, but soon I realised that my interest, where I could really pursue that interest to take it further in that journey, was to think about sort of policy from a national and an international perspective. And that's, I think, where the APS and the opportunity really came to me. And I took that step to apply and got a job in the APS and moved to Canberra in that way. And I think I haven't really looked back. I've worked in some different areas and in some different agencies and in some different places over the last 20 years. So I'm really grateful for taking that step and making that move, because I think it's enriched my professional life and personal life in a lot of ways.
Excellent, thanks for that. Martin, you touched on just briefly when you were talking earlier on what prompted you to join the APS, and I think it was that idea of service, if I remember rightly. Is there can you expand a bit on that? Because you were in the private sector, and perhaps that's unusual maybe for people to move from private sector law firms into the public sector.
And I think it's not a bad pathway. In fact, working in the private sector, does have its benefits in assisting with work in the public sector. A bit like Aidan, I grew up surrounded by teachers and became the black sheep of the family by deciding to do law instead. My motivation, I must admit, for joining wasn't specifically with the idea of joining the APS. Rather, my motivation was joining the Commonwealth DPP as a prosecutor, and an opportunity came up as a 30-year-old when I'd been in that large firm doing a range of different things over 6 years, and I'd been involved in a bit of court work which helped me with the skills to pass across to the Commonwealth DPP. But from uni days, I definitely had an interest in criminal law, and along the way always had a leaning towards more public service work through being involved in Rotaract and other things of that nature. Something I would say about moving over to the APS through the Commonwealth DPP is working in the Commonwealth DPP. It's more about, in my mind, the practice of law rather than the business of law, if I could put it that way. So rather than allocating to a client the amount of time the client can afford, it's about applying the time and effort that a matter deserves. And that's a fundamental difference to me and a motivation. That, of course, doesn't mean that you sit on your hands and take as much time as you like and cause undue delay. We all have to work hard and efficiently on the task at hand. But that for me was a real driver, the ability to apply the time and effort that the work requires to do it well, to do it very well, rather than the eye to the budget, the timesheet.
Look, thanks for that example, because I think it's a really great illustration of how the APS at times can be criticised. People say there's no economic imperative or no budget bottom line, no shareholder no possibility of shareholder action, although you could say that's not entirely true, but to drive efficiency. But what you're illustrating there is that actually that creates an environment where professionalism and true, a real thirst for quality can be allowed to flourish. And look, we probably don't always get it right, that balance right, but I think that's an interesting illustration of the counterpoint between those two competing principles. we'll move to the next question, which we'll move to the next question. What's your proudest moment during your APS career? So we're trying to, through this event series, we're trying to, as I've said before, highlight the real diversity of public service work and what it is that people have been able to achieve during their public service careers. So I'll go to you again first, Aidan. What is it that you're most proud of if you look back over the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, I thought about this a little bit. I mean, I think it's hard to single out any one moment, but looking back, I guess, and a couple of them areas have been touched on, was the areas that I've been probably looked back and been most proud of being where I've worked in a team, and often they've been a small team, that has achieved something that's actually, I think, has had a real impact and left a bit of a legacy, and certainly has exceeded my expectations before I went into that. I was a bit uncertain of how things would work. So I've sort of drawn from that. And I actually have two examples, so indulge me. But the first one was the Australian Consumer Law Review. And that one was where it was the first time the law had ever been reviewed. It was a national law that was traditionally or previously was several state laws that then we formed a national law. And it was the first time that was being reviewed. It was a 5-year review back in 2016. And I guess, Commonwealth state review, so there's certain complexities that come with that. First review, so it was very little in the way of precedent to draw upon and how to conduct that. It was also an area of law that is pretty well known to the public. So, it's an interface, and we as consumers touch on it all the time. So it was certainly out there. There was a lot of interest through consumer advocates and the general public. So it's quite there were a lot of areas of the law which were quite contested. So it was something with some really delicacy and sensitivity to work through. And there were different views within jurisdictions about what reform opportunities there were. So I guess that was the challenge, and being part of a process where originally I was sort of working in the Commonwealth Treasury around sort of the policy that representing the Treasury's interests around that law, and then moving across to set up and then lead a secretariat where we drew in resources from different states and territories, and put in place a process over about a year to really reach out, obviously consult, get feedback, and through the various processes that you often do with reviews, but really sort of craft a process of engagement, of reflection, of interrogation of all the different provisions, do it in a very public way. We did roadshows all around the country where we met with stakeholder groups. And I think at the end of it, it was a really successful outcome. We provided a sort of a blueprint for governments over the next decade to think about a number of areas of consumer law reform, and that's something that's still being played out. And I think just the way that we were able to bring different views together, different jurisdictions together in an area that was quite contested, and to build consensus and reach an agreed outcome, and do that within the timeframes was something that I've been really proud of. Just briefly, the other example was Phil, you mentioned about when I worked as a technical advisor with Papua New Guinea Treasury. I was the only Australian advisor within the PNG Treasury, so I was the only sort of foreign official working in that environment. And as you'd probably imagine, it can be quite a challenging work environment. There's obviously the cross-cultural differences, but also you're working in an organisation where capacity is fairly low, and certainly taking on the hosting of APEC in 2018. There was a sense of, in some ways, a bit overwhelmed about what they would do in relation to that, and playing as such a central role in helping them think about how to craft a policy agenda and drive a year of activities in the PNG Treasury's sort of remit, which was in the sort of the finance minister's process and the economic committee, was really, I think, coming into it, it was quite daunting, and really, I guess, as what helped me get through that was to reach out to people, particularly back in Australia, to bounce ideas off, but obviously to work closely with the people on the ground there. So I think, in terms of the way it sort of played out, we had our sort of bumps along the way, which I'd expected, but really, I guess, to basically exceed expectations from the other economies around what PNG could do. They basically chaired a process, led those discussions. We got a communique at the end of it, an agreed statement, which can be quite challenging in a lot of international fora. I think really that gave me some pride and built the confidence of my colleagues along the way that they could actually achieve this. This was something they hadn't really sort of lifted their head too much in these sorts of fora previously, but you could see their confidence build through the year. And that made me really proud, and I really hope that helped them stay in the way that they think about their own domestic policy work after that experience. So that's another area that I think I've been very proud of reflecting on.
Excellent, thanks for that. Just to follow up on that question, that topic of PNG, the question I wanted to put to you was the link. How did you see the link between the work you were doing, providing that support and advice to PNG Treasury, and your role as a public servant serving the government and the people of Australia? So, was that something that you sort of thought about at the time, or that you've thought about since, and how those two things came together?
Well, I guess this is how Australian government looks at a lot of things around PNG and maybe the Pacific more broadly, but it really was in our interest to have a successful Papua New Guinea. And obviously the institutions and the strength of those institutions is really important as part of that. So I guess, and obviously as we think about that particular agenda that went through that, through the APEC process, was also to help gently sort of make sure that it goes in a direction that we think makes sense from Australia's sort of engagement point of view as well. So having that opportunity to work with PNG and craft a policy agenda and the particular policy issues that we focused on that year were ones that Australia also thought were meaningful and worthwhile, both for PNG but also in Australia's interests and hopefully the broader, and certainly the broader sort of APEC community. So I guess, being able to think about it in that way that, while we're sort of providing support in an overseas country and building capacity in that sense, you really often think about, strengthening institutions in other countries, particularly in our new neighbours and areas which have got some real development challenges. That's really in our interest as well, because certainly if things go the wrong way, then that becomes a big problem for Australia. And I think part of that is really taking a broader view about what's in Australia's interests in that regard.
Awesome, thanks for that. Martin, we'll come back to you, which is to ask you about your proudest moment during your APS career.
Well, I think that sense of pride hasn't been so much in any one thing as the accumulation of lots of smaller but no less important things. I've derived a lot of personal satisfaction from being part of the beginnings of many legal careers and seeing young lawyers develop and get their early opportunities, such as helping them through conducting their first trials and things of that nature. I've been involved in and very pleased to see more opportunities go to women in the department, and I've played quite a part in the equitable briefing of female barristers. Like Aidan, those teamwork opportunities are really important and something that I derive a lot from, such as being, in my case, being part of the implementation of a national practice group model in terms of looking at our structures around managing through areas of practice rather than regional management structures. Just picking one of many cases, there would be the prosecution of the crew and the organiser of the people smuggling vessel that came up against the rocks at Christmas Island in December of 2010, arising from which many lives were lost, about 50. There was a trial which ended up in a hung jury, and the matter then proceeded to a retrial. And for some reasons, it was nearly the case that retrial wouldn't be able to progress to getting before the jury for decision. And having along the way spent a lot of time with the victims and hearing their stories, it was very important for me in that case to work to ensure that justice would be served by the prosecution of that matter progressing to the jury because of the enormous suffering that had occurred to the people on that vessel and their families. And the matter went before the jury and was ultimately successful. And then, of course, we had the prosecution of the organiser of that vessel, who even after organising this vessel that came up against the rocks with so much loss of life, then continued to organise other trips of people on these horrible vessels, knowing what had happened before. So being able to achieve justice for victims generally, but in that case too, was something I often reflect on.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and I'm struck by the fact that, you know, it's clearly a different ballgame entirely, but a similarity between what Aidan was talking about with PNG, and that I'm assuming they were not Australian citizens. They were not. No one involved in that was an Australian citizen. The victims were not Australian citizens. The crew were not, and yet it is, you know, it is an act of service in and of itself to be able to try to achieve justice and to demonstrate that it's in Australia's interests, I imagine, to be seen as a nation where justice is and the rule of law is valued, and victims' stories and experiences are treated with respect. So it's fascinating. We've had so many different people speaking at all these events around Australia, and to see some of these common themes and threads which emerge is really fantastic. I'll stay with you, Martin, if that's all right, and ask you about difficult work situations and how. I mean, I imagine that you have come up against some very difficult work situations. How have you managed your own resilience, your own personal resilience, when you've had to deal with those sort of situations?
Sure. Look, resilience is easy on a good day, and it's much more challenging on a difficult one. You know, there are some things that we can influence, and other things that we have less ability to influence. And, you know, one example for me are challenges around attrition of experienced staff, when that mob on the other side, the state public service, you know, can pay quite a bit more level by level. So that can be a bit of a challenge. For me, managing resilience, well, I look to surround myself with good people, so that there are good people to share the load with and talk to about what we're doing. I've been part of building resources so that staff have a lot of guidance material to go to help them out, to help them manage their workload. For me and others too, I think it's really important to have, you know, good mentors through your career, people you can go to as opinion leaders, if you like, to give you that support. You know, sometimes when things are really hard and you've got lots of competing priorities, sometimes you just need to pick that one thing, you know, to start with. You know, so part of your prioritizing and your planning ahead, sometimes you just have to pick that one spot to start. You know, I remember back in uni days, I wasn't always the sharpest student at law school, and, you know, sometimes in subjects like, you know, property law, which I can't stand, you'd strike an exam paper and you'd have to do several essays, and you'd read the whole exam paper and think, bugger, I don't think I know anything about any of these questions. So then I would think, all right, just find one that I think I know a little bit about, and I'd find that one thing and deal with that one answer. And then I'd look at the rest and figure, well, what's the next one that I might know something about? And in that way, you know, I would work my way through that and come out the other end. So, you know, that's part of managing, you know, resilience, of, you know, focusing on something in front of you and not getting overwhelmed by the totality, and finding that way. When dealing with difficult situations, such as being, you know, co-counsel with a senior counsel or counsel in a trial, and there are difficult issues ahead. Sometimes, you know, driving into work, I would focus on the fact that the day would end, and then I'd be driving home at the end of the day. So I'd have some, you know, suitably somber, classical, calming music on the way to work, and knowing that on the way home it would be something a bit more raucous and uplifting that I might be playing on the CD player on the way home. So what I've learned through my years in the office is to be able to trust in my own ability, and to appreciate that some days will be good and some days won't be so good. And then, of course, every weekend I'll go for a bike ride down to the beach with friends and have a swim and a cup of coffee and a enormously fattening bacon and egg roll, and cycle back home after that. So the point of that is that it's important to have things to look forward to. Our resilience is helped enormously by having those things ahead of us, planning for a holiday, the big things and the little things that we look forward to, and that helps us get through.
Excellent, thanks for that. There's a follow-up question which I'll put to you, which has come through on Slido, which is how about managing your staff? So it's not your own resilience, but you've got a sizable team working for you. How have you managed your staff and the varying workloads throughout the last year? And so this is touching, I guess, on particularly under that, the difficult conditions of COVID, restrictions of COVID-19.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's about providing support, being there to assist, putting trust in my staff too. When someone's doing their first contested magistrates court trial and they're getting worried and stressed about that, I will say, listen, I've made the decision that you're appropriate to do this matter. I'm accepting that risk. You go there and do your best, and know that you can contact your direct supervisor and me for support. And then in big trials, making sure that you're planning ahead and wrapping the right resources around it. You can't always produce extra staff, but there are things that you can do to support people by directing them to the resources that we have. We do a lot of child exploitation, online child exploitation work, which has some quite high pressures and stresses around that. So we have systems in the office where people have well-being checks regularly, and also the ability to do that whenever they need. I've got a good management team around me who provide really good support to their staff too. When we had periods of lockdown and periods of remote work, it was very important to keep in touch in a number of ways, picking up the phone, video link calls, and that sort of thing. So with assisting the people around me to manage their resilience, it's a matter of giving them the support and the resources to assist them in what they're doing. It's a matter of being there to help out and having really good methods of communication, not just telling people that they can contact me whenever they like, but proactively doing that and making that contact.
Yeah, great.
That helps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Aidan, I'll come to you. I might go actually to one of the questions that's come through there and ask you to answer it, which is, what has been the most positive experience within your organisation from 2020? And that actually aligns to one of the questions, sort of one of the scripted questions is close to it. Something positive. Obviously,
Yep.
COVID, it's important to remember in all of this that there have been really negative impacts for people and families across Australia from COVID. So, we're not going to pretend that it's all been rosy by a long shot, and including a number of people who've died. But some positive has come out of it. Aidan, is there anything that you, looking back, that you can reflect on in that light?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Obviously, it's been a challenging time for all people and organisations, and certainly in the Treasury, there's been a lot of work done around supporting people in terms of remote work, and then looking at how we transition back and the like. But I think one of the things from just the way that we operational side of our work, and as you'd imagine, Treasury's been fairly heavily lent upon over the last year in terms of advising government in a range of areas and programs, etc. I guess one of the most positive things I've seen through that has been that a lot of the information silos that existed have broken down to some degree, and a lot of more collaboration across divisions and groups, which has been really, really important. And obviously that was kind of essential at the early stages of the pandemic, because we had so many cross-cutting issues, and we needed to bring different groups together to come up with joint sort of proposals and responses around the advice we provided. But what the department did do was it actually took some deliberate steps to put in place processes to facilitate information sharing and collaboration. So we had mechanisms, and I guess the technology had kind of enabled that. A number of people working from home, so we spent a lot of time getting used to different sort of platforms for WebEx and Jabber and other sorts of platforms but it actually did help facilitate bringing sort of wider groups together at different points in time. And certainly how we really lifted the way that we regularly reported on what the priorities were, what we were hearing from government about what they were interested in, what the hot issues of the week were. And also when we talked to external stakeholders, and particularly with business groups, how we shared that information. I think probably a lot of organisations can be a little bit territorial about the information that they hold, but certainly I think that a lot of that to some extent broke down. We still have a little bit of a way to go, but that's certainly a really positive development. And it sort of initially happened at more senior levels, but it really actually did filter within groups and divisions to actually set up sort of at the EL level and APS level networks where there was much more sharing in a regular way. And a lot of those processes were really kind of informal and open and inclusive, which was really important. They weren't sort of bogged down in that sort of formality. A lot of them had to be very, very nimble and responsive. So I think that was a really important development. I guess working in Perth at that time, I'd only been across for 4 or 5 months before it shut down. And as we know, it was a hard lockdown for most of last year in WA. It meant that I certainly didn't feel as isolated as I possibly would have otherwise, or detached from Canberra. I mean, it certainly had to get used to, with the time difference, get used to some pretty early morning starts. So a 6:30 a.m. teleconference wasn't unusual. And certainly having school children, it certainly taught me to make sure I could nimbly operate the camera and the mute button when it was needed around that. But I think it was really important that collaboration and that sharing of information, which is being sustained. And I think we've actually, Phil touched on the business liaison unit that I'm part of as well in my role. I mean, that sort of morphed from an original coronavirus business liaison unit to become a more permanent part of the way that we operate. And that's really doing much more sort of cross-sectoral, I guess, stakeholder engagement, but really how they engage with other parts of the department in our sort of macroeconomic side of things, or our other sort of policy areas, to really bring them into how we engage with our stakeholders and when we share that information. I think that's been really important. So I'm hoping there's been a bit of a cultural shift in that direction, which will sustain it beyond the pandemic.
Excellent, thanks for that, Aidan. Look, I'm conscious of time, so I'll probably ask you one last question each, which is, and it's one that's come through on Slido there. So in sort of 30 seconds or so, what advice do you have for making WA-based national roles work? What is your pitch for these roles? So you've just touched on that, Aidan, in terms of being ready to be up at 6:30 for a teleconference, but anything else you could briefly add to that?
Well, I mean, I guess the COVID experience has sort of shown that remote working can work. I mean, there are pros and cons around that, and we're still learning how we can make that as effective as possible. But we certainly, I think, have surprised ourselves in how we can operate in a more of a distributed way. So in some ways, those sort of traditional physical barriers that might have been thought about as it, and coming from a kind of a central policy agency, admittedly, we had a small presence prior to the pandemic, but that's actually grown a little bit over the last 12 months over here, has shown that we can operate in that way if an organisation has the mindset and the supports to do that. So I think from an operationally, I think we are starting to think more about how we can operate more across the country. And that includes in places like Western Australia. Certainly in terms of what we do over here, in terms of our work and how we report back, is to really keep demonstrating the value of having a presence here. Now, obviously, the work that we do is really around building those stakeholder relationships, obviously working with parts of the WA government, particularly with WA Treasury, but also linking that back, reporting back on what's actually happening in a regular way, and providing some real granularity so people see that, and sort of being, not risking that you're sort of out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. So keeping to maintain that engagement, reaching out, and really evaluating where, because there is a perspective that we have over here. The economy is quite different. Often the cycles are different. The structure of the economy is different. And I think sometimes that can not be recognised as much as it could be. So I think there's really contributions that we can make out of Western Australia in the APS, and certainly from a policy sort of role, from an economic policy agency, that's important. But it's really to keep demonstrating that, and to show that it's worth having that presence here.
Excellent. And I'll leave it with you, Martin, for the last word on this, which is any advice you have for making a WA-based national role work.
Yeah, look, it can be challenging. One of the banes of my existence is rocking up at work and getting several emails from the people on the other side of the country because of the time difference, particularly when it's daylight saving and 3 hours. But I would say that the time difference is a superpower. I have a really good librarian in Perth and an IT officer in Perth, and I have those resources because they can assist the East Coast when people on the East Coast have left for the day. I can assist young lawyers on the East Coast when their supervisors have left for the day. When I've got a really curly legal issue that has to go, because of the delegations, has to go beyond me, I can send that off in the afternoon, knowing that there's a pretty good chance that when I arrive in the morning, the answer's going to be there because there are people on the other side working on it 2 or 3 hours before me. As Aidan says, there's obviously the need to be flexible and to be able to work around those different times, which might mean in a national role you're starting a bit earlier and finishing a bit earlier. But definitely that you have to turn the time difference into a superpower.
Excellent. That's a great way of looking at it. That's a great way to finish up, actually, because the time difference doesn't give us extra time, and we've reached the end of our time. But look, a really big thank you to you both. Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Martin, for giving generously of your time this morning. And and look, our aim was, as I've said a number of times, to showcase the diversity of what the APS does and this common ethos of service that underpins everything that the APS does. And that's certainly come through clearly to me. I hope it has to everyone else as well. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in and who's put questions through, both to Mary earlier and to Aidan and Martin now. And look, we'll leave it at that. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks once again.